decided to make a cutting board, an end grain cutting board. And from the little research I did on YouTube, everybody just cuts little pieces and glues them together. So that is what I'm doing. After collecting all my pieces into a box, I then promptly dump them out onto the table. All those little pieces. After cleaning up all the little blocks by sanding the edges smooth, I started reassembling everything by gluing my little blocks together. I didn't know the best way to clamp everything together, so I started just by clamping smaller strips of my little blocks together and building it up from there. After the glue had dried on those small strips, I took them to the table saw just to clean up each side. I then started to glue my strips together to build a nice big board. I did this in sections, just to try to keep my boards relatively flat so that I would save a lot of time sanding later on. After the glue had dried on the cutting board, I took it back to the table saw and started cutting it into 45-degree angle strips. After cutting my strips out on the table saw, I laid them out onto the table. From here, I started flipping strips around one way and another, trying to create a bit more of a random pattern. After the pattern was figured out, I glued it all back together to make one nice big board. After the glue had dried, I took my cutting board back to the table saw and started cutting it into strips. I cut it at a 45-degree angle, opposite from my previous cut. This would give me more variation in design later on. Back at the table, I laid all my pieces down and started rearranging them again, trying to find the best kind of fit. Here you see me clamping my strips back together. I did this in smaller sections, trying to keep them fairly flat. I did a poor job of that, as you can see the center one having a big ridge to it. But the flatter it is, the easier it is sanding later on. Some big arm is stuck in front of the camera. Now, because I had cut my board so many times and re-glued it, I had lost a lot of material. So I had to improvise a bit, and I decided to build a bit of a picture frame around the center of the board. This would help me get back to the original length and width that I was originally going for. The glue up was fairly simple, just needed to clamp the sides on and on to the next step. I decided to glue some small blocks to the sides of the board. This was only to prevent tear out when I sent the board through the planer. It's not so particular where I place them, rather that they're there. After multiple passes through the planer, I finally got the cutting board down to the correct thickness. Now comes about 4 hours worth of sanding. Here you see me adding finish to the cutting board. I'm just using plain old simple mineral oil. I always like to pour a whole bunch of oil onto the cutting board and slowly spread it around with my fingers. It always amazes me how adding the oil to the board just makes the wood just come to life. Now normally I would have done this ruddering before I put oil on the board, but I forgot. All I'm doing here is putting a small bevel just halfway along the sides so that you can grab the board easily from the table or countertop whenever you want to move it. Let's make a pizza! First, we lay down some homemade pizza sauce. Add your favorite kind of cheese. Slap on some meat. And add some leafy green stuff to the top.